merci à Sommet
Thank you, Jacques, and
m'avoir
thank
invité
you, Shahab,
ici.
for inviting
That's all my
me here.
French done. Yeah, very kind. So I've been told by the interpreters to speak slowly. I have a tendency to speak very quickly, so I'm going to make them sweat now. Let's see how I do. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you today about toxicant and carcinogen exposure. And what I'm going to, first of all, I should declare an interest. There are various interests that one should declare. The only one I think that's of importance is that I'm a vapor, okay? So the context for this presentation really is the controversy that surrounds safety claims. Following the publication of a Public Health England report in 2015, which included the phrase that e-cigarettes are likely to be around 95% safer than smoking, dismiss, which was also then repeated by the Royal College of Physicians report a year later. There were very quickly thereafter some editorials, including in The Lancet, which is a very respected journal, as well as the BMJ, and also, for instance, this year, yet another editorial comment on this, which all point to the fact that there's no hard evidence at all that the e-cigarettes are 95% less harmful, and it's based on expert consensus alone. And this has led in the media to people to claim that academics may be at war over these e-cigarette claims, with some saying they're not as harmful as cigarettes, and some people saying they're as harmful as cigarettes. And so I'm trying to really answer this question today: is the 95% harm reduction claim justifiable or backed up by hard evidence? Now, before I can answer this, I think I have to go through some key considerations, or a priori consideration. The first one is a very simple one, and it doesn't require any kind of higher degree. You don't have to be an associate professor to know this, is that combustion is key when it comes to the harms of cigarettes. And so cigarette smoke contains around 600 compounds, including around 17 known carcinogens, which are then quickly turned into over 7,000 chemicals through burning at about 800 degrees Celsius. And this compares with an aerosol produced by an e-cigarette, which is heated up to around 250 degrees Celsius, which mainly contains nicotine, some humectants, including propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin, and flavorings. So you would have to assume, based on simple chemistry alone, that e-cigarettes have to be safer than cigarettes. Anyhow, assessing this and trying to answer this question is quite difficult for a number of reasons. The first one is that you really ought to look at humans, not animal studies. I'm sorry to say to anybody who likes animals on animal models, I'm not such a big fan for various reasons. The first one is that there has been a failure to replicate animal studies due to poor design and important physiological differences. For instance, mice or rodents tend to be much more nicotine sensitive than humans. And if you look at trials, so I also do a bit of neuroscience and work in Alzheimer's disease, the usual translation rate of successful trials in animals to humans is around 8%. It's not a great number. And to just highlight the reasons why these things are difficult if you look at animals as opposed to humans, I just want to pick up a paper that was published last week, which purports to show that nicotine in e-cigarettes causes cancer. There are a couple of things one should remember in this context is these people used a mouse strain or mouse breed that has a high propensity to develop cancer anyway. So the control group here were mice that were exposed to fresh air, and then mice that were exposed to an e-cigarette vapor without nicotine, and then another group of mice that were exposed to an e-cigarette vapor with nicotine. Now, the mice that had only fresh air to breathe, about 11% of those died or developed cancer over this 1 year time course. So these mice already have a propensity to develop cancer. In the group that were exposed to e-cigarettes with nicotine, 22%, so double that, developed cancer. What's important is you can't make mice vape an e-cigarette, right? I mean, you can't make them smoke a cigarette either. So there's some differences in terms of how ecologically valid this particular experiment is. And just to point this out, I think that Professor Dautzenberg also came up with a number for this. These mice were exposed for 4 hours continuously to nicotine vapor at 36 milligram per mil, mg per mil, for 5 days a week, continuously. In fact, the condition was so extreme that 3 mice died during this experiment. Nothing to do with cancer, nothing to do with any of these things they were discussing, just because it was so aversive. And what it translates as is that these mice were forced to inhale 7 years of vapor within 1 year only. What you mustn't forget as well is that there was constant voltage applied for 4 hours continuously to vape that e-cigarette. And if I use my e-cigarette for longer than a minute, it heats up immensely. So you can assume that if this runs for 4 hours continuously during the day, that it may overheat and therefore produce carbonyls, among other things. The other thing to remember is, of course, is that we have homeostatic responses, i.e. we can recover. Nobody sits there and vapes for 4 hours continuously. So this was prevented by forcing these mice to inhale this for 4 hours continuously. The other thing to remember, for instance, is that mice do certain things that humans don't. So if you're in this chamber and you're exposed to all the vapor, it deposits everywhere, including the fur of the animals, as well as on the floor of the cage. And humans don't run around licking floors, mice do. And so it's likely that they're also exposed secondarily to these constituents in the vapor. And we know that nicotine can oxidize to NNK, which is carcinogen, if it's left for a long period of time. And nonetheless, these authors, given all these problems, claim that e-cigarettes and nicotine e-cigarettes causes cancer, when we know it doesn't cause cancer in humans. IARC has mentioned this over and over again. So, don't look at animals, look at humans if you want to answer the question of how safe these things are. The other thing I would say is looking at the aerosol that's produced by e-cigarettes is not particularly helpful because people interact with the device. And so really what you have to look at is body level exposure, what gets into the body of a human. Just to give you an example of why it's problematic, in the 1970s, a bit of a public health disaster, which was, public health officials didn't actually mind this at the time, it seemed. Light cigarettes, so-called light cigarettes, were introduced into the market. And what happened with these light cigarettes is the only difference they had is they put perforation holes into the filter. These perforation holes sit outside these cigarette testing machines. It draws in more air, therefore dilutes what comes out at the other end. And people were saying, oh, well, we've reduced nicotine content, we reduced tar content. Any smoker smokes for nicotine. What did they do? They covered up the ventilation holes. And so they inhaled exactly the same amount as they did before. So the light cigarette was a sham, didn't really work. Now, you can also do the opposite. You can try to not decrease the aerosol or the smoke content. You can increase it. And this was done in a study published a couple of years ago, where the coils were so overheated that they produced actually much more formaldehyde. This is the e-cigarette value. And here is the cigarette value, so much more than a cigarette would produce. Of course, again, it's not ecologically valid, because if you were to inhale this, your face would look something like this. It's called, dry puff. It's disgusting. It's very, very unpleasant. So no human would actually use voltage settings like this. Okay, so we have to look at body level exposure in humans, and I would say we have to focus on smokers, not never smokers as comparator. And the reason for this is that if you look at the data, these are from the UK, most people who use e-cigarettes are either former or current smokers. So these are the latest data I could find. You can see the gray line here is never tobacco users who use e-cigarettes at any level in the UK. And these are ex-smokers, and this is increasing, and these are current smokers. So vast majority of people who use e-cigarettes are current or past smokers, so we should look at them as a comparator. And we have to focus on relevant and meaningful outcomes. Now, ideally, we would look at diseases. Problem is with these diseases that take about 20 to 40 years to develop. So we have had e-cigarettes around for a decade, so we haven't got the data to look at these chronic or diseases such as lung cancer. And the other problem is, of course, the diseases, because people are either former or current smokers, if there's a disease that develops in somebody who's an e-cigarette user, it's likely due to the smoking that they did before. So there's confounding going on. And to just show you how quickly this happens, I'm afraid if you are a smoker, I would suggest that you go away from this. If this is the only message you take with you today, if you're a smoker, is to stop smoking as soon as possible, because it used to be thought, due to the Doll and Peto studies, that if you stop smoking before 35 years of age, you probably get away with it. No, that's not the case, I'm afraid to say. This is the Million Woman study published in The Lancet, which showed the risk and increase in all-cause mortality as a function of your age of stopping. And here it shows you, at age 29, if you stop at age 29, you already have an increased risk compared to somebody who's never smoked. So these diseases are usually irreversible if you're a smoker, which is a problem if you want to work out whether e-cigarettes are less harmful. So maybe we can look at harm biomarkers, not at diseases, because they can be tested now. We don't have to wait for 20 or 40 years. But the problem with these is that if these are biomarkers of chronic effects, they're also often irreversible. So for instance, you could look at DNA adducts, but they tend to take at least 10 to 15 years to reverse if they reverse at all. There's a nice little structure of DNA for you. So maybe you should look at risk biomarkers. They can also be tested now to look at acute changes. Back. But the problem is they're very difficult to interpret. And the reason I'm saying this is a paper that was published, you don't have to know the details about this, which purported to show that if you use an e-cigarette, you increase your aortic stiffness to the same extent as a smoker, which is quite worrying, I'd say, if you think about cardiovascular disease. Now, the same authors also published a paper showing that aortic stiffness increases if you drink coffee. And aortic stiffness increases if you exercise regularly in the gym. So clearly that marker is not very informative if you want to work out long-term health consequences, unless you think drinking coffee or going to the gym is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Unlikely to be true. So we can ask ourselves, should we just give up? We can't look at diseases, harm biomarkers, risk biomarkers, so we can't know the long-term consequences. And I would say no, of course, we can look at other things, including exposure biomarkers, which can be tested now, which is good. There are short-term and reversibles. There won't be any confounding with past smoking. I hope I'm not going too fast. And we have decades and decades of research to guide us on well-characterized smoking-specific biomarkers, because we don't exist in a vacuum of evidence. We have prior research on tobacco, so we can apply this to evaluate how dangerous e-cigarettes are. So I'm not going to go in too much detail about the 4 biomarkers I'm going to look at, but I just want to show you 4 well-characterized biomarkers that we think are very important in estimating the risk associated with using e-cigarettes. The first one is a nitrosamine called NNAL, which is a metabolite of NNK, which is a known potent lung carcinogen. It's in fact one of the very few and well-characterized ones where you can show longitudinally when people have this in their body, they are more likely subsequently in humans, not in animals, in humans to develop cancer. And it's eliminated out of your body quite quickly, so no confounding with smoking. 1-hydroxypyrene, 1-hop, is a biomarker for what are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Again, these are very potent carcinogens, and also quite specific to tobacco use, and they're also linked to cancer risk later. And they're, again, very quickly eliminated out of your body. Then you have 3-HPMA. I won't make the translator say hydroxypolymeric mercuric acid, but she can try. These are markers of volatile organic compounds called acrolein, which has been linked to respiratory problems. And they're relatively specific to tobacco use again. And the aldehydes in general, although not this one in particular, have been linked to cancer as well. And they're quickly eliminated. And lastly, carbon monoxide, which you know is a toxin, and is also specific to tobacco use and linked to cardiovascular disease. So these are the 4 I'm going to look at. And I did this as part of an update of the PHE report. So I'm not just going to look at my own studies, but also at other people's studies. And so here are 10 studies that have looked at this. And first of all, we look at this nitrosamine NNAL. These studies mainly looked at 2nd and 3rd generation e-cigarettes. And the next slides all look the same, so I'm going to walk you through it very slowly. we have studies in length of abstinence from cigarettes and lengths of use of e-cigarettes from left to right. So somebody on the left-hand side, these studies had people who had stopped smoking quite recently, had been using e-cigarettes only for a short period of time. And on the far right side, people had been absent from cigarettes for a long period of time and had been using e-cigarettes for a long period of time, up to 2 years, I think. And here we see the level set at 100% for smokers. So we have the comparison between long-term users of e-cigarettes with current smokers. And these are the levels that observed in NNAL across these different studies, the different types of studies, RCTs, cross-sectional studies, etc. And what you can see is quite significant reductions in this known carcinogen. The average reduction was 91.4%, which is quite close to the 95% reduction in risk that is claimed by PHE. The first 3 studies, in fact, people had been absent quite short periods of time, so we think there's still some confounding going on. So if you remove those from this analysis and just focus on the last, where people had been absent for at least a month and had been using e-cigarettes for at least a month, you can see that the reduction is the weighted average 96.4%, which is very close to the PHE estimate. Good news. Now, if we look at 1-hop, so this is these are biomarker, is a metabolite of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There are only 3 studies I could find at the time. I'm sure there are more now. And what you can see is the reductions aren't quite as great. The weighted average reduction, nonetheless, it's 57.6% here. And the Gionowitz study, in fact, had people, this was a switching study, where we think that some of these people cheated and they were still smoking cigarettes. So if you remove that study and take it out, you can see the reductions are around 62% for this particular biomarker. Now, we had also 8 published studies that looked at this biomarker or metabolite of acrolein, 3-HPMA. And here we had mainly second-generation e-cigarettes. And what you can see is quite a lot of variation in the reductions across different studies, including my own. We didn't find such a great reduction. Nonetheless, weighted average is about 60% again, a reduction compared with cigarette smokers. So e-cigarette users who are long-term users have a 60% reduction in this biomarker, which is a bit further off from the PHE estimate. And then lastly, carbon monoxide, same as before. Just going to rush through this a little bit. We have reductions of around 80% compared with people who are smoking cigarettes still, which is also a bit further off from the PHE estimate. So on the basis of this, can we say then the 95% harm reduction claim is justified? I would say yes, certainly, if we look at the best biomarker here, the best characterized toxicant, carcinogen, which is NNAL. Not quite if you look at some of the other biomarkers, including 1-hop, 3-HPMA, or carbon monoxide, because the reductions were around 60 to 80% compared with cigarette smokers. But there's still a net benefit, even if this were true, there's still a net benefit if you think about it at population level. Unfortunately, David Levy just ran out, but I'm citing his study here, which showed that if in the US, everybody switched over now, everybody who's a smoker now switched over to vaping, you would save, with a 95% risk reduction, you would save 6.6 million lives in the US. But even if the risk reduction is only 60%, if everybody switched over in the US, you'd still save 1.6 million people's lives, which is pretty impressive for public health intervention. But the key point to make here is also the 3 biomarkers where we didn't see a reduction have also other exogenous sources other than tobacco. So it could very well be that those people who have, slightly higher levels than we see with NNAL may actually not get this from the e-cigarette, but maybe from the environment. Who knows? And so for those studies where we had data, we also looked at the level of exposure of non-smokers to see whether the environmental exposure could explain the less than 95% reduction. And so here are the smokers' values, as I showed you earlier, for 1-hop, 3-HPMA, and carbon monoxide. And here are the non-smoker levels. Very, very similar. So in fact, it is probably true that based on these biomarkers, if you switch over to e-cigarettes, you are, much closer to the non-smoker than you are to somebody who's a cigarette smoker. And so a better way to phrase it, I think, is if you are prepared to say that not smoking is around 95% safer than smoking, it's likely to be the case for e-cigarettes as well. So I think it's quite a justified claim. I want to make a couple of caveats quickly. The first one is that, of course, we only looked at a number of biomarkers, so we are limited in terms of some of the analysis here, and there might be other ones we haven't thought of that would be good to look at. And it's unclear whether there is a threshold effect or linear effect, so is a 95% reduction in exposure equal to 95% reduction in harm? We don't know. And of course, there may be other unknown harms that we didn't consider, including the mode of delivery. A lot of these things, obviously, unlike nicotine being normally absorbed through buccal or dermal absorption, it's inhaled. There might be unknown pathways. Propylene glycol may lead to the formation of propylene oxide, which is carcinogenic. We have changing use pattern, which may have an impact on the risks. And also changing products. I mean, Juul, for instance, is a product that we didn't... I know, I'm running over, aren't I? I'm very quickly done in a moment. This is stress-inducing. Thank you. But based on the balance of probabilities and based on the lack of combustion and exposure levels observed in humans, e-cigarettes have to be less harmful than cigarettes. And you have to be an idiot to claim otherwise, frankly. I can't have, listen carefully in biology or chemistry in school. Or maybe you didn't go to school, I don't know. Now, quickly, finally, I just want to address which has already been mentioned, the concern around vaping lung deaths reported in the US. There is also some data already on lung function. It's not like, again, there's no evidence, prior evidence before this came up. First of all, a result from a large trial showed that respiratory symptoms actually improve in people who switched to e-cigarettes. So people who had used NRT had worse respiratory function than people who used e-cigarettes in this trial, which would suggest that the latest spate of illnesses can't really be to do with standard e-cigarettes. We also know that if you look at people who might be particularly sensitive to the effects of inhaling toxicants and asthmatics, that if they are using e-cigarettes for a long period of time, you can see here lung function plotted across 24 months, so 2 years. Lung function in people who were asthmatics, who used e-cigarettes, didn't change very much at all over these 24 months. Same is true for people who are dual users in this particular study. And if you look at, I don't like animal studies that much, all these poor mice that are killed for no reason whatsoever. But if you look at some of the animal studies or basic science, you can see that e-liquids downregulate the immune response in some studies, epithelial cells, but not in other studies. And what's interesting is that there are some studies that suggest actually that vegetable glycerin, one of the humectants in e-cigarettes, is actually anti-inflammatory, which would suggest it might be actually beneficial rather than harmful to the lung. Now, what's going on? You wonder, we know this already. Why is there suddenly this increase in vaping lung deaths? We know there are about 40 million users have been using them for about 10 years, and there have been very few problems reported. And suddenly we get these reports that occur primarily in the US in July and August. What it suggests is these are very acute events, and so they must have an acute cause. To put it in context, which was the case in the UK, if suddenly people are dying from eating cucumbers, you wouldn't necessarily say, well, cucumbers are clearly dangerous and harmful. It's probably something to do with the way that the cucumbers have been treated. In this case, it was salmonella, so you remove the salmonella-infected cucumbers. You don't say, no more cucumbers for the rest of eternity. And it's quite clear here that we can assume there's something going on with the e-liquid that these kids, and these were primarily adolescents, had been using. They were bootlegged illicit products. It has been linked to cannabis oil. Part of the reason why it might be problematic to use THC or cannabis oil is that it's not, by the very name of it, it's not really water soluble. So PG and VG are water soluble. They are humectants. They are hygroscopic, which means they attract water. And The THC oils, it might very well be that people use solvents that are not that good, that are good for dissolving the cannabis in it, but not very good for your lungs. Because inhaling oil into your lung indeed is not very good for you. So I suspect this might be part of the reason. The other thing is, as with anything else, if you buy something illicit or illegal, as for instance class A drugs, if you're unlucky, it's cut with certain things, adulterants, that can be very harmful. So I suspect this is a problem in the US also because they don't have the European Tobacco Protocol Directive, which cuts down on black market products. So in the UK, the advice remains the same. E-cigarettes are much less harmful an alternative to smoking, which helps smokers to stop. And I hope people see sense and don't suddenly outlaw e-cigarettes in the United States. That's all. Thank you very much. I want to acknowledge some of my colleagues.